Hello, I'm Emmy Vadnais, and I'm delighted to invite you to join me for my Intuitive Development How to Trust Your Inner Knowing class. We'll meet for 4 Saturdays starting October 28th on Zoom Live Video. There's a special discount for new Thinking Aloud volunteers. I'll personally guide you to connect with your heart, enhance decision-making, and empower yourself. Ready to embark on this transformative journey? Visit emmyvadnais.com to learn more and reserve your spot.
I imagine that by now many of you already realize that, in conjunction with White Crow Books, we've just launched the new Thinking Aloud Dialogues book imprint, and our first title is There Life After Death? New Thinking Aloud is a non-profit endeavor. Your contributions to the New Thinking Aloud Foundation make a meaningful difference in our ability to produce new videos.
Thinking Aloud. Conversations on the leading edge of knowledge and discovery with psychologist Jeffrey Mishlove.
Hello and welcome. I'm Emmy Vadnais, co-host with Jeffrey Mishlove. Our topic today is Yoga Wisdom for Modern Seekers. My guest is Rizwan Virk, who is an entrepreneur, video game pioneer, film producer, venture capitalist, and computer scientist. He was the founder of Play Labs at MIT and is currently working on his PhD and teaching classes at both the College of Global Futures and the Fulton Schools of Engineering at Arizona State University. He is also an advisor to the Galileo Project. He is author of The Simulation Hypothesis. An MIT computer scientist shows why AI, quantum physics, and Eastern mystics agree we are in a video game. Startup Myths and Models. What you won't learn in business school. Treasure Hunt. Follow your inner clues to find true success. Zen Entrepreneurship, Walking the Path of a Career Warrior, and Wisdom of a Yogi, Lessons for Modern Seekers from Autobiography of a Yogi. Riz has been interviewed 2 times previously on New Thinking Aloud, and I'll link to those interviews in the upper right corner of your screen. Riz is based out of Tempe, Arizona, and is currently in Mountain View, California. Now I'll switch over to the internet video. Welcome, Riz. It's a pleasure to have you back with us on New Thinking Aloud today.
Thank you. It's so great to be back with you today. I think this is my 3rd interview with New Thinking.
Yes, it is. Your latest book highlights the classic book Autobiography of a Yogi in the context of the modern era. How did you come to write this book?
Well, it was an interesting, set of coincidences that led me to write this book. As you may know, I have some previous books, including one called The Simulation Hypothesis, which was about the idea that the world is like a video game. And I had quoted Yogananda a few times in that. And then that happened right around the time I was going through a bit of a health crisis, and I spent a lot of time on the couch. And I ended up rereading Autobiography of a Yogi, which I had first read in the 90s. And, it's always a joy for me to go back and read that classic book, because I really enjoy his stories of, swamis and saints in old India and, miracles and levitating saints. And so I ended up writing a few essays about, Yogananda, his book, and other books that were like Autobiography of a Yogi, just because I was looking for more things to read when I was done. And I didn't really intend to, write a book about Yogananda. I just did that for fun as something to occupy my time. And then, about a year later, on the 75th anniversary of the release of Autobiography of a Yogi, which was released in 1946, I got an email from HarperCollins in India. And they said, well, we want to do something for the 75th anniversary. And we don't want to just reprint the book. We'd like to, get a modern take on it. And we'd like you to write it. And so at first I was like, really? You want me to write it? I'm a big fan of Yogananda, but I'm not part of his organization, at least not formally, just, as a student of his teachings. And I'm a businessman. I'm not a swami. I'm an entrepreneur. I write about technology. And they said, yeah, but we want you to talk about modern ideas, like your idea that the world is in a video game. And we want you to relate those and lessons you've learned, in today's world. And we want you to relate those back to, not just the autobiography, but to the ancient Indian wisdom that is what, the autobiography was really about. And so, I had one of those feelings that you get sometimes when there's an electric feeling that when okay, this is actually something that I should do. And so I thought about it for a little bit, and then I said, yeah, this is absolutely something I should do. And so it was as if the universe placed the task in front of me, and that it was a task that I was supposed to complete, whether I felt ready for it or not. And to be honest, that is one of the lessons that's in the book, is that sometimes the universe gives you an unexpected task. And, the same thing happened with Yogananda when he was a relatively young Swami, in teaching in a place called Ranchi in India, teaching these, young boys in a boys' school. And he was given a vision of some Caucasian looking people, and he assumed they were Americans because he had never met an American up to that point in his life. And he ended up going back to Calcutta, and he got an invitation to go speak in Boston there was a big Congress of World Religions. And now if you think back to it, he wasn't the best person to go and represent, the Swami order. He was a relatively young, unknown Swami. He rarely ever gave a lecture. He had never given a lecture in English, right? He had completed 2 years of college, but only because his guru made him. He didn't want to. He just wanted to go and meditate. And so on the one hand, you might say maybe he wasn't ready for it. On the other hand, it was kind of a karmic task, right? It was a task that was given to him and put in front of him, and he accepted it. And he came to the West, and he lived here for, a long period of time, becoming what many have called the first modern guru. And so that was how the book came about. It really was through an invitation that was completely unexpected. But, the more I thought about it, the more my writing has been about bridging different worlds, whether it's bridging the worlds of business and spirituality in my first book called Zen Entrepreneurship, or the worlds of science and technology with mysticism, which was, my simulation hypothesis book. And so, in a sense, that's this book. Yogananda's book was a bridge. It was a bridge between the East and the West. And it was a bridge between Hinduism and Christianity at the time. He quotes the Bible a lot. But it was also a bridge between ancient ideas and the modern world. And that's kind of what my book is as well. It's kind of a reinterpretation of some of those stories. And what should we as modern thinkers think about these stories? How should we relate to them? Are the lessons still relevant to us today?
Your book has now become a bestseller in India, and Yogananda's book, Autobiography of a Yogi, is a classic now. Can you share a little bit about who this man was for those who may not be familiar with him?
Yeah, absolutely. So, he was born in India around in the 1890s. And when he was a young boy, he had this vision of seeing these yogis meditating in the mountains. And he said, "Who are you?" And in this vision, they responded, "We are the yogis of the Himalayas." And suddenly he had this strong intuition that he was going to be a yogi. And he kept trying to run away from home when he was a young boy to try to run off to the Himalayas. There's some really colorful stories in the autobiography, and even up to the point when he was in high school, he and his friends ran away from home, jumped on the trains to try to go to the Himalayas, and his father or his older brother, would chase him across northern India to bring him back because they thought he was too young to go off on his own. And I think, he had a strong vision of being this yogi that was wandering, and he was right in the general idea, even though the specifics were he ended up being a yogi wandering around America, not around the Himalayas. He actually spent very little time in the Himalayas. And so he came to Boston in 1920, and basically decided to live in America for a few years. And so he began teaching, these ancient Indian ideas. And he was one of the first Swamis to really make, the U.S. his home. And so he crisscrossed the country, traveled to the West Coast, gave talks everywhere, which were attended by, in some cases, over 1,000 people. I mean, there are pictures of these large stadiums where he would talk about how to apply ancient yogic philosophy to life. And then, he eventually established his headquarters for the Self-Realization Fellowship in Los Angeles. And, about 15 years later, he went back to India for a little while. And then when he came back, and we can talk about this later, but that's when he focused, more on writing his autobiography. So until then, he had spent a lot of time, basically on trains. Back then, people didn't use planes so much. Automobiles is somewhat. He died in the 1950s. And then, his book, which was published just a few years before he died, really was kind of the sum total of many of his teachings, and became a huge bestseller in the 1960s. And so when the whole counterculture started, right, many young people in the US of that generation were looking for other spiritual ideas, and they turned towards Eastern ideas. And turns out, the Autobiography of Yogi was one of the most passed around books of that generation, right? I mean, there was always a paperback edition kind of about this size, right? And, in fact, I just talked to somebody who was in San Francisco during, the late 60s in Haight-Ashbury, and he said, yeah, someone just gave me a copy of this paperback, and I read it. And that was, that was very true. I mean, if you look at the top 10 books that people read around that time, this was one of those that was passed around kind of by the hippie generation, if you will. And so that's when it really became a huge bestseller. And then since then, it served as an introduction and an inspiration to people on the spiritual path, right? The book is not a set of techniques. It's rather a set of stories that wrap up these ancient Indian ideas of karma, of samadhi, of yoga. And, today we're pretty familiar with yoga, right? Because there are so many yoga studios pretty much on every corner. And we think of it as the asanas, or the physical postures. But, Yogananda didn't emphasize those. In fact, there's very little on the asanas in the autobiography. But for many people, this was their passport, right? This was what got them excited. George Harrison was a huge fan from the Beatles, and he used to have stacks of these books, and he'd give them out to basically anybody he thought needed regrooving, to use the terminology of the day. And Steve Jobs, who also went to India during this time, he ended up being a huge fan of this book. He read it every year. And according to his biographer, it was the only book on his iPad. This was a couple of years before he passed away. And then after he passed away at his memorial service, everybody got this little brown box, and they took it back and they opened it up, and there was a copy of Autobiography of a Yogi inside. And so you can see it had a huge impact on that generation. And then, for myself as a kind of a Gen Xer, my mentors were of that generation. So they were the boomers, right? And they would pass on books like this to us to read. But I'm finding that, a lot of younger people have not necessarily read Autobiography of a Yogi, even though it's been out there and it's a huge bestseller. And so that was part of the reason, why I wrote this book, was to kind of bring these stories up to date. Yogananda is also a good example of what scholars call the pizza effect, which is this idea, like with pizza, it started in a small region in Italy. It came to the US. But what we think of pizza was really kind of a US invention by modifying what was originally pizza. Like it was just a little bit of bread with a little bit of sauce on it, I think, originally. Now the American idea of pizza has gone back. And if you go to Italy, you can have, American style pizza when you say pizza, because that's what everybody thinks it is. And so Yogananda's then teachings went back to India, and he became really well known there over the years, both because he was kind of an informal ambassador for Indian philosophy. But then over time, I would say he's almost better known there today than here in many ways. My book first came out in India in April, and as you mentioned, it's become a bestseller there. You can go to the airports in like New Delhi or Calcutta, and it's on the bestseller shelves there, which is exciting. But he's an example of that pizza effect. That's how yoga has evolved in many philosophies and religions over time. They go on to other cultures, and then they get transformed a little bit by those other cultures, still having the core ideas. And then they travel back. And so Yogananda is kind of one of the primary examples of that in this space.
Right, because he lived most of his life here in the U.S. And not only did he impact the West here in the United States, he also greatly impacted the East in India and beyond.
Yeah, absolutely. So he was a great, I think, example of that. Now, that said, he lived most of his adult life here, and he published this book in English for an American audience. And, and if he had published it in India at the time, it might have been a different kind of book, right? There might have been a lot of things that perhaps they took for granted. But now India is modernizing, right? There's a quote in my book from Rudyard Kipling, who said, "East is east and west is west, and never the twain shall meet." And I say, well, that's relevant today for not being relevant at all, right? Because the world is so interconnected, right? India, China, all parts of Asia have modernized so fast that, during Yogananda's time, you used to think of India as a spiritual place and the West as this materialistic place, right? But today you'll find as much materialism, in the East, in the streets of Mumbai or Shanghai or, Lahore, where, near where I'm from, that and the cultures, because of the internet and the way we share videos and the way we share information, is very similar, and the rate of modernization. So in the same way that Yogananda's message was needed here, while America was modernizing in the 20th century, right? It's been just as needed in India and other countries as they've been modernizing in the late 20th and early 21st century as well. And so, Yogananda himself was a bridge between these worlds. And the book, because it was written here, in some ways is actually more relevant to India today than it would have been if he had written it in India back then, right? Because he's looking at it from a modern perspective. He's modern during his time, right? He's bringing in the modern analogies and the science and technology of his day, right? And if he were alive today, I think he would do the same today.
In your book, you pull out stories from Autobiography of a Yogi and you present them as lessons. And how did you come to selecting those various stories to share in your own book?
Well, that's, an interesting question, because I don't know that that was so much a logical process as much as an intuitive one, And so, I also thought about how these lessons might have impacted myself in my own life. I sometimes I found different stories that were saying similar things, right? Or they were wrapping up a concept that was an important lesson, for me to learn. I also interviewed, a number of people who were big fans of the autobiography and for whom the autobiography had an impact on their life. And I asked them, what stories do you remember, right? And there were many stories that were in common. And, because it's a 500-page book, there are just way too many stories to cover. And so I wanted to capture the highlights of different ones. So for example, I just mentioned these stories about Yogananda running away to the Himalayas. Well, those stories were, throughout his childhood. So it wasn't just one story. But the lesson there that I came up with was that sometimes you don't have to go to the Himalayas, right, to find your spiritual path. Because it turns out, in the end, Yogananda's guru, the one he eventually, became associated with, was Sri Yukteswar, who was in Serampore, which was just 12 miles outside of Calcutta, and Calcutta's a huge city, right? So he was very close, right? In the end, he thought he was going to go to the Himalayas, but he ended up finding, his spiritual mentor right close to home. And it turns out Sri Yukteswar was kind of a brother Swami to Yogananda's father and his mother, who were both disciples of Lahiri Mahashai, who we can talk about in a minute, from Benares. But it was a much closer, right, association than I think perhaps he expected at the time. And, I mentioned Steve Jobs earlier. He went to India when he was a young man, and he, in his hostel or his dorm room there, somebody had left a copy of Autobiography of Yogi, and he brought that back, and that ended up being the book he read a lot. And in his case, he didn't necessarily practice the exact meditations that Yogananda taught. And that's true, I think, of most people who read this book. They get inspired to find their own particular path by bringing in these different ideas. And, while I was writing this book, I interviewed a Hollywood producer. His name is Peter. And, he earlier would go to Rishikesh, which is in India, which is where kind of the Beatles went with the Maharishi back in the day in the 60s when they, there was a really big news story. And, but he went there to try to find, this Indian spirituality. And while he was in a bookstore there, he saw Yogananda's book and this picture of him. And he recognized the picture because it had been in the Los Angeles paper in Hollywood. And then when he read the book on the way back, and then he found, one of Yogananda's organizations, SRF temples, like within a mile of Hollywood, right? And so, there's yet another example of where you don't always have to go somewhere else. And so, even in my own life, the person who the teacher that recommended that I read this was back in the 90s. I, was off in Europe at the time. I was dissatisfied with my job. I quit my job and came back to Boston, to Cambridge, right near MIT, to work for a startup. And I was looking around for some spiritual path and was thinking I may have to go to California, right? In the US, California kind of served that role back then, at least back in the 60s, 70s, 80s, as perhaps, going to India did for the counterculture of a place. And it turns out right next to the startup that I went to work for, there were some guys teaching meditation that was part of this other lineage. And then I ended up, spending some time with those guys. And then, that's how I came. It was actually a Caucasian, guy, a white guy with curly blonde hair who told me to read the book. And so it was yet another example of, I was born in that part of the world, but I came here and, I found, kind of the start of my path there. And so that's an example of a set of lessons that were both based on stories, but also based on Yogananda's life, and then based upon other people that I have interviewed as well. And so I think that's an interesting lesson for that reason.
Since you just mentioned California, the headquarters of the Self-Realization Fellowship are in Los Angeles, and he actually wrote the Autobiography of a Yogi in Encinitas. You actually took a pilgrimage there and had a vision of Yogananda. Can you share that experience with us?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I had agreed to write this book, and I had started writing the book, and it was going along kind of slowly, and I was looking to do something that would give me the inspiration to kind of complete this book. And one of the lessons in the book is based on, what Yogananda did in his life, which is go on little and big pilgrimages, go out of your way for little and big pilgrimages. And he would do this all the time. Like, he would go out of his way, whether it was when he was a kid, he would take multiple buses to some temple on the outskirts of the big metro area of Calcutta. And then later, as an adult, while he was traveling, he would take out to find some natural spot of beauty or some place where a saint lived before, and he would use it as inspiration. And so I thought, well, it would be great if I could go visit the place where Yogananda wrote Autobiography of a Yogi. And he spent, pretty much the last decade of his life in the Encinitas Hermitage, which is just north of San Diego, right on the Pacific Ocean there. And so I thought, and I had been to that area before. There's even a little beach there where he used to walk, and they call it, the formal name now is Swami's Beach, because he used to just walk up and down this beach all the time. And so I was hoping to go there, but the problem was this was in the middle of COVID, right? And they had closed it off to the public. And so I thought, well, do I want to go all the way there and not be able to go inside? And so I contacted the folks at SRF, and they were able to arrange a private tour for me, during the COVID time. And so I went and met some of the monks that lived there, because it's an actual hermitage, where the monastic order, the folks live there. And not only was I able to spend time admiring the beautiful scenery in the building, but I got to spend a lot of time in his private office, in his study where he wrote this. And that was where, you could hear the waves of the Pacific Ocean, because it's right overlooking the cliffs. And there's like a door to a little patio that goes out there. And I just naturally got into a meditative state. And this is what would happen with Yogananda a lot when he went to particular places. And while I was there, I had a very strong vision of him. Not only did I feel, as I was walking into the study, with his bedroom and his study were like right across the hall from each other, I felt this weird energy like when I went through it. They told me that's not that unusual. People do feel like an interesting energy between those rooms, because that's where he spent most of his time. But then when I was in the study and I just got into this meditative state naturally, I had a very clear vision of him, like much clearer than I've ever had. And in it, he was standing near his desk, and he had a stack of papers, which of course is, how books were written back then, right? They didn't have computers. So that was the manuscript. And in my vision, he was kind of looking at me like, see, there's the papers. And as I was watching him, he opened up the French doors, that kind of led out to the ocean. And much to my horror, he took the papers and he flung them out, to the Pacific Ocean, and they scattered everywhere. And I say much to my horror because there are a lot of horror stories in the past when that was a manuscript where it got lost and the book was lost at that point. So I'm like, well, what are you doing? And he had kind of a mischievous glint in his eyes. And he said, watch. And then what happened was each of the papers turned into these little white birds in my vision, and they went off, to all these places around the world. And he was like, see, as a writer, this is what's important. Your words will carry on long after you're there. And so that was one of the messages that I got. And then another message that I got there was to be a little more playful, with the process. And after that, not only did I get this vision, but it was as if the energy kind of opened up, and I just said I was going to have fun with writing this book and write these stories about, saints with two bodies and appearing in multiple places, like all the stuff that I read about when I first read the book and was amazed, like genies appearing and making objects disappear and appear in other places and stuff, and then try to take a more modern take, on perspective on these stories and say, what should we think about them? But yeah, that was the vision that I had there, and it was pretty powerful for me.
That is a beautiful story and deeply touching. The Autobiography of a Yogi book is replete with those types of stories where Yogananda describes meeting with swamis and saints and has these experiences that for many decades people are still questioning, are they real or not?
Yeah, and I think that, that happens. And I think what I try to do is to put the stories in context, to say that, Yogananda was telling the stories as he heard them. And in other cases, he actually witnessed the events. And other times there's a lesson embedded within those stories. I mean, let's take, for example, the story of the Tiger Swami, right? Which is one of the stories. When I interviewed people, they always remembered the story of the Tiger Swami. And the Tiger Swami was a guy who, was kind of a feeble young man, but he built up his body and he had this desire to fight tigers, right, with his bare hands. And he became known as a tiger fighter. And he would actually, literally knock these beasts out. And he became kind of famous for it. And at one point, he was told by a Swami through his father that, okay, you've done this now. It's time for you to start, turning your attention away from fighting these tigers, because of karma. Turn your attention away to doing other things like meditating and more spiritual pursuits. And of course, he didn't listen, right? As a young man, he went to this one province in India, and the Raja or prince of that province said, well, I've got this fierce Bengal tiger named Raja Begum. And, if you fight him and defeat him, I'll give you all this wealth and all this fame. And of course he said yes, and then it turns out this was the most difficult fight he ever had. And I mean, he did in the end defeat the tiger, but the tiger ended up mauling him so much that he ended up, losing a lot of blood, and he got ill, and basically he had to spend 6 months just laying down and doing nothing. And then he found after that experience, when he finally healed, he had no more desire to fight tigers. And then he sought out the Swami, and he became a Swami himself. And that's why he's known today as the Tiger Swami. And so Yogananda met, this Swami when he was a kid, and he asked him, do you think that I could fight tigers? And he said, yes, but there are other types of tigers, right? There are your inner tigers of doubt and ignorance, and that is what you should focus on. And that was kind of the lesson that Yogananda was trying to convey. But at the same time, I think there's an interesting karmic lesson here as well. And it's that, the Tiger Swami, Sohang Swami was his ordained name, that he was drawn to this weird thing of fighting tigers, and that we are drawn in the world to certain outward battles and certain outward tasks, right? And that is part of our karma. It's almost like he needed to do that to fulfill some karma, but then he stayed fighting his outer tigers too long. Perhaps he should have then shifted at that point. And I tell my own story, in the book where, for me as an entrepreneur, I've been fighting these battles in the business world, much less dangerous from a physical point of view, right? But I spent a lot of time in the business world, but I also had this vision, even when I was a kid, saying that I was going to be an entrepreneur and then I was going to be a writer. But every time I finish selling a company or something and say, okay, now it's time for me to go off and be more spiritual and do my writing, I'd get sucked into another startup in Silicon Valley. And and what happened to me was at the height of my business career, I was at MIT actually mentoring a lot of startups. And I ended up having, a serious setback. I ended up having serious heart surgery. And if you've ever seen heart surgery, it's kind of like getting mauled. I mean, you basically open up your chest. And I spent the next 6 to 9 months pretty much on the couch. There was not much that I could do. And for me, I during that time, I had my own visions where I, no longer had the desire to do too much in the business world. Because whenever I tried to jump back in the business world, I feel a little better, and I try to jump back in, and my health would get worse, and I'd end up back in the hospital. And through a series of visions, I got this message that, I've been fighting these outer battles. It's time for me to focus on my writing, and I did. And because I had enough energy to get in an Uber and go to Starbucks and do some writing, and that was about as much energy as I had for that day. But it worked out because I ended up publishing 2 books in 9 months, including my best-selling book, The Simulation Hypothesis, whereas in the previous 10 years, I had barely finished, published 2 books at that point. And so, for me, it was the same kind of a message that it was okay to fight your outer tigers. That is what your karmic script may have called for. But then there are other elements to the script. And so you don't want to spend too much time fighting your outer tigers. Now that story was, there's a clear lesson there around karma. And there's a few other stories like that you can kind of look more closely behind the miracles and say, well, this is really a story about karma. And I can go into that now or later.
Definitely. I think karma is a really valuable aspect of your book and, of course, Yogananda's. And I'm also curious how your health is doing, in addition to how understanding the autobiography more deeply has impacted your own personal journey.
Well, sure. So on each of those, so first of all, my health has been much improved. That took place about 5 years ago now. So it's been quite a few years, and I was able to kind of get back on my feet, and now I'm at Arizona State University, teaching and working on getting a PhD. And in the book, I talk a little bit about my parents' journey. From Pakistan. I was born near Lahore, a city where Yogananda lived when he was a baby, and there was a story about a magic amulet, that we can talk about there as well. But and then Yogananda had to catch the first boat out of India after World War I because there weren't any boats to take him to the West. And my dad came to immigrate to the West. And he had to take the first flight out after a war in 1971, and he got delayed because of the war. There were no flights out of Lahore because it's right on the border with India, and that's where the war was going on at the time. And he had first gone to Paris to get a PhD, and then he settled in America like Yogananda did. And so I saw a lot of parallels, with Yogananda as an immigrant, and as an immigrant. It's the children who end up being more like a mix of the cultures, right? They end up being, a combination. And that's true, I think, in America as a melting pot more than anywhere else. And that's true of Yogananda. And of course, Yogananda had no children, but he had his literary children, right? And that's why, this book, Autobiography of Yogi, I think was so important in the introduction, which was written by, I think, an Oxford professor who studied Eastern traditions, who said, it was one of the first books by a yogi about yoga, right? It was an authentic book for that reason. It was authentically Eastern, but it was also authentically Western because he spent most of his life here, and he became an American citizen towards the end of his life, and so in a sense it was a blend. And so I kind of view people like myself who were the children of immigrants as a blend of these two cultures. And during writing this book, my father passed away. Right around the time that I had finished the book, and I was reflecting on his journey. Yeah. Thank you so much. And, I ended up writing a little retrospective about his life and the things he did along the way. And it kind of amazed me to look back at, all the things that he and my mother, did when they were younger to get us here, and all the struggles. And Yogananda also went through many struggles while he was here. If you read Autobiography of Yogi, you think, oh, he had such a magical life. He just prayed to Divine Mother and everything just kind of came to him. And that, wasn't necessarily the case. In fact, he had some huge setbacks. One of the biggest setbacks happened, around the time that he came, in 1935, he'd gone to India, which was a triumphant trip, and he came back. And his number 2 guy, who was his brother Swami from India, a kid who had meditated in his attic because he didn't have enough room in his own house to meditate. So he had meditated with Yogananda. He became Swami Dhirananda, and he was kind of running things while Yogananda was running around teaching all the time in other places. And he ended up leaving his organization. There was a whole scandal, first of all, because in the papers where some husband of a woman that was studying with Dhirananda was upset that they were using incense and chanting in these dark rooms, and he came and he hit him, bopped him on the nose, and it became this huge story. Like today we would say it's a story that went viral, right? In basically all the newspapers in America were covering, strange Hindu love cult, right? Even though there was none of that actually going on. And of course, Yogananda was the better known Swami. So everybody assumed it was him who the guy had come in and punched. And so anyway, this created a huge scandal. And then Dhirananda eventually left the organization and took a bunch of folks with him. And it made Yogananda, kind of reevaluate what he was doing here. And he went to Mexico and meditated and gave some lectures. And he was praying, Lord, let me just go back to India and meditate. This is too hard trying to, bring these ideas and build an organization and do all the things. But the answer was no, this is your task. This is what you need to do. And so he began looking for a different way after that, rather than always running around himself all the time. And that's why he spent a good decade writing the autobiography in Encinitas. And that became a way to reach not just thousands, but really millions of people around the world. And so, there were just a lot of parallels that I saw there during the writing of this book. And so, I was able to reflect on that and also see how it applied to kind of my own life also.
In what ways has the autobiography impacted you in your life or assisted you on your spiritual journey?
Well, it's a good question. And I would say it's been different at different points in my journey, right? So one of the points that I make in Wisdom of a Yogi is that the autobiography, its primary purpose was to inspire and to open up people's minds that these other things may be possible, right? And it was also a way to introduce these ancient, Indian philosophies of yoga. And, so when I first read it, I was mostly just reading it because there were these cool stories of these swamis. So I'll give you one of the stories that stuck in my mind that I never, I didn't even need to read it again because I remembered it so vividly. It was, so Lahiri Mahashai, who was Yogananda's guru's guru, he met this seemingly immortal Swami who lived in the Himalayas, who is now called Mahavatar Babaji. And even in India now he's called that because that was kind of Yogananda's, terminology that he used in his book, and the book has become so popular there. And of course, Babaji said, Lahiri, you have come. Don't you remember, you meditated here at this cave with me in past lives? And of course, Lahiri didn't remember. He was some 30 years old. He was a government employee. He had kids. He'd gotten married. And then eventually, he tapped him on the third eye and he gave him some stuff. And then he eventually remembered all his past lives. And so he then initiated him into yoga up in the Himalayas here in the foothills, near a place called Raniket. And during that time, supposedly, right, in the story, Babaji materialized an entire palace, like a golden palace, right? And so this is a story that sounds like it's out of the Arabian Nights, right? In fact, some people accuse Yogananda of, making up stories that sound like they were, in the original Aladdin story, the genie makes for Aladdin, this giant palace with resplendent with jewels. And what Babaji tells him is, that Lahiri, you expressed a desire in a previous life to live in a palace, like a princely palace. And so I'm creating this palace for you. And Lahiri was amazed because to him, it looked like it was a literal palace to show you, one, that this is a dream world and, that a man of realization can create things that look and seem real, but two, to resolve that karma, right? You don't have to worry about now having to have another life where you live in a palace. And it shows the inner workings of karma here, right? That karma comes not just from actions, but it comes from intentions and thoughts and feelings, that he had that strong desire and it was fulfilled out there. So that's like one of the stories that was so vivid the first time I read the autobiography. But I think for somebody like me, who's also, within the world of science and technology, I had just graduated from MIT. A lot of my friends were very materialists. They had a materialistic point of view, a very scientific point of view. And at first glance, you say, no, that's not really possible, is it? Right? And so I think originally it was just an inspiration, but then over time, as I've gone back, and every few years, I would reread it, either the physical book or the audio book. And there's a great audio book of the autobiography read by Ben Kingsley,
wow.
which is really well done. And in fact, I'm having the audio book, narrated for my book right now. It should be out probably by the time that this interview goes live. And so, I had to direct the narrator to the Kingsley book just because you have to listen to how he read.
Yeah. Can you sound like Kingsley?
Yeah. Can you sound like Kingsley is what I told him, right? Or at least for the pronunciations, right? for, because there's so many Indian words, and yet it's a book written in America. So it's an interesting mix of the two. But then over time, Yogananda has meant a lot to me because I've gone back as I developed this philosophy to tie together the worlds of science and technology. And one of the things that I found really compelling, and not the first time I read the book, but later, was that Yogananda would bring up to date, these ancient metaphors that were used. And one of the biggest ones was the dream metaphor, right? And the Buddhists use the dream metaphor quite a bit. The world is like a dream, right? And I mentioned the story where Babaji was talking about the world is like a dream and we're creating this dream palace for you, but it looks real because all of this isn't real. And, Yogananda was watching these newsreels of World War I. And so this is an example of a story that didn't make an impact on me when I first read it, but then later, like in the last 10 years or so, it made a huge impact on me. And, he saw these newsreels and World War I, they didn't call it World War I. They called it the Great War because that was the war where, more people died than any other war before because they were using mechanized, machine guns and artillery in ways that they hadn't before. And so he saw these newsreels and he said, Lord, how can you allow such suffering? And when he was meditating, he had a vision of being out on the actual battlefield. And he saw, in 3D, kind of panoramic, holographic view what it was like. And again, tears were coming to his eyes. And then he got a clear answer saying, look closely, what are life and death but relativities in the cosmic dream? To think of the newsreel you just saw, that is a motion picture. What's happening now in the battlefields of France is also like a motion picture. The world is like a motion picture, that it's a play of light and shadow on a screen. And of course, the suffering is real, within the movie. But if a character dies, the actor doesn't die, right? That is a part. In fact, the juiciest parts, right? If you look at people who get Oscars for an actor, are the ones that involved a certain amount of suffering. And so he would use this analogy that the world is like a movie projector, right? It's he used like an Italian word for a certain type of art called chiaroscuro, which is the play of light and shadow. And so he would use this analogy to say, look away from the screen, right? We're so caught up in the warp and woof of Maya, right? Which is a term for illusion. But the real definition of Maya is more than just an illusion. It's like a carefully crafted illusion with which we fool ourselves, right? In a sense, it's like if we go, the analogy that I've heard used is if you go to a magic show, right? The guy's not really sawing that woman in half, right? But you're amazed anyway because you want it to look like he did, because that's what causes the amazement, right? And that this world is like that. That is a kind of a play. Now, if Yogananda were alive today, he would say, and he's used this metaphor of the dreams of life and death, he would say, are like doors from one dream into another, right? But if he were alive today, he would say it's like a movie, but we were all in the movie as players or actors, but we're also watching the movie. We have a script, but we can change the script. We have free will. We can make choices, and we're doing it together. I think he would say that the world is like an interactive, massively multiplayer role-playing game. It's like a video game, right? And of course, I spent the last decade in the video game industry. And so for me, it would be his metaphor of the film projector, which was the latest technology, right? I mean, he came to America in 1920, over 100 years ago now. That was the latest technology. They even called them bioscopes back then. They had all these different terminologies for films. But if you've ever been in a movie theater, and if you've ever kind of looked around in the middle of the movie, you see like people are so engrossed in the movie because that's what you're there for. You're there to lose yourself in the screen, but you can also see the flicker of light, which you can't see if you just watch the screen. You think it's continuous motion. You can see the frames flickering. And so yoga, to me, as I started to get deeper into it by rereading Yogananda, reading Patanjali, who wrote the Yoga Sutras, and this is a realization I came to only, in the last few years when I was formulating this idea that the world is like a simulation or a video game, is that yoga is about looking away from the screen, that it's about calming the vrittis. Right? If you look at the ancient Sanskrit definition of yoga in the Yoga Sutras from Patanjali, and Yogananda talks about this in his book, it kind of gets lost a little bit because of all these fantastical stories. But it says yoga naroda, yoga chitta vrittis naroda. Yoga is the cessation of the vrittis. What are the vrittis? Vrittis are like whirlpools. And so they get translated as thoughts or waves of consciousness. And so I kind of reinterpreted the different translations for this book. It says yoga is the cessation of the whirlpools of thought and feeling in the river of consciousness, right? Because if you have a whirlpool, it's got to be in something. But it's not just thoughts. I think a lot of the translations of the Indian concepts, they especially like when you talk about the Buddhist translations, they get caught up in this mental idea, but it's not just the mental, it's the desires. It's our attachment to things, right? That is an important part of what yoga is. And so for me, it kind of redefined my spiritual perspective and on the path. And so, that's another way. And then when I've gone through, tough times, we all go through tough times. And that's, one of the lessons in the book is sometimes we have setbacks in our lives, and those setbacks are part of our karmic script. Like in my case, this is the first time I've written about this kind of major health crisis that I had, but it was like one of those, what they call the switchblades in the railways, right? When you have the two tracks, it's like, you're going on this track, but perhaps, you had agreed to go on this track. And so we need a way to shift you over to this track. And so in the end, I viewed it as, a blessing and a curse because I had to go through the physical suffering that was involved with that, but a blessing because it helped, kind of the setback was actually part of the story, just like Yogananda's setback. He may not have written this book in the same way or spent the same amount of time, a whole decade writing this book and making this book his primary method of teaching out there if he hadn't had his other setbacks, right?
At the same time, those desires and feelings are all part of our karma for our own soul's development.
Yeah, and I agree with that. And that's why, I told the story of the Tiger Swami, right? Because we have these karmic desires and we have these karmic scripts. And that is part of the reason that we're here, right? I mean, if we're here in the game, part of the reason is to play the game, right? It's to enjoy, or in this case, Yogananda says, ceaseless joy is not the nature of this physical world, right? And we know that. He says, so ceaseless joy is what you can get to by quieting, these, the storms of the vrittis. It's kind of like the snow globe, right? That we have. If you have a snow globe and you shake it, you can't really see anything clearly. But when you calm it, you can see more clearly. But you could also see more clearly, perhaps, the intuition and the clues that are there to guide you in what you were meant to do in this life. And I one of the things that I talk about is with near-death experiencers, they record having the life review. And in the life review, it's like a holographic panoramic review of everything they had done in their lives, right? And so it's kind of like a gameplay session. If you go to YouTube today, it turns out among the most, if not the most popular content on YouTube is recordings of video game sessions, right? So you're not playing the video game. You're watching people who already played the game and you're replaying it to see what would happen. And to me, the life review sounded like this kind of a thing where you could basically replay. Everything is being recorded. The whole three-dimensional world, which we think of as being so real. And so what is the purpose of the game? The purpose of the game can be revealed by what we do afterwards. We look back at it and say, okay, this is what you were supposed to do. Which of those things did you do? Which of those things didn't you do? We cross the veil, the river of forgetfulness or the veil of Maya, so that when we're here, we forget these things. And that's why we need our intuition to remind us of some of those karmic, scripts that we might have agreed to. At the same time, I feel like we have the opportunity to make those choices, right? Because, I've always felt, I always had this inclination to be a teacher and get a PhD, but at the same time, I wanted to be an entrepreneur. At the same time, I wanted to be a writer, right? And so while some of my friends in their 20s, after we graduated, went on to the academic world and got their PhDs, then it was sort of something I put on the back burner and assumed I would just never do because I was too busy with these other elements of karma. And I view these karmic tasks or desires as like quests in a video game. Right? And so the way video games are built today is you have a set of quests and you can say, okay, I choose this quest now. and you go and you fight this battle. Maybe you raid a castle to get the gold from the orcs or something, right? And then that opens up more quests along the way. And so I view it as we all have a set of this database of these quests out there, and we can choose which of those to take on. But there are some that we said, okay, we definitely want to do this, right? And we may do it later, right? We may do it, like I'm getting a PhD at a relatively late stage in my career after having had a successful career doing other things. That's pretty unusual in the academic world, although it's becoming more common now than it was in the past. And so I'm kind of taking that quest, which was put back on the shelf, and bringing it back. And so Lahiri, who was Yogananda's guru's guru, and who kind of brought, his particular lineage from Babaji in the Himalayas, he was a householder, is the term that they use. I mean, I would use modern yogi, right? He had a job with the government. He kept his job even after he was pretty much realized and enlightened and could do these miraculous things, right? People have saw him do quite a few things, materialize his body hundreds of miles away, right? But he kept his ordinary job until he retired on a pension for the government, and then basically sat in samadhi almost 24/7 after that, right? And so he always said, you need to add yoga to the things you're supposed to do in this world, right? As opposed to something else. He also said, you need to add it to whatever religion you are part of. If you're a Muslim, you still do the namaz prayer. If you're a Hindu, you may do certain rites. If you're a Christian, you still do your prayers. And then yoga is a practice that you can add on top of that. And so that was an important, part of that as well for me.
I like how you describe how there's a similarity between karma and playing a video game with quests and also achievements.
Yeah, and I'd love to give you another example from Yogananda that was one of these miraculous stories that your first reaction is, did that really happen or not? And so Yogananda was in Serampore, which is where his guru was, and his guru made him go to college, right, and finish, even though he didn't want to, he just wanted to meditate. And so he had a dorm room, near the college, and his guru, Sri Yukteswar, was there, and he said, in this very room, in this very building, I witnessed 4 miracles from a Muslim fakir, which is kind of their term for like a sadhu or a seeker or a holy man. And what happened was this fakir, Afzal Khan, when he was younger, he came across this Hindu yogi who he had given some water to, because the guy was thirsty, and I guess it was a time of sectarianism between Hindus and Muslims. And so the guy said, it's great that you did not succumb to this ungodly sectarianism, right? And so he decided to reward the boy because of his good karma, and he taught him a series of techniques. And these techniques gave him control over an invisible entity, which he called Hazrat. Now, I've interpreted that to be a jinn because, he's a Muslim fakir. In the Islamic traditions, there are these kind of beings called jinns in the Bible, and in the Quran. You can talk about Solomon and how he had, control over the jinn. And so this guy, Afzal Khan, began, and he said, be careful though, because from previous lives, you have a tendency to be avaricious, right? To be greedy. Right? And so what did this guy do with his newfound powers? He would tell Hazrat, who could go and just make any object disappear. And he would go to a jewelry store and touch these objects, and then he would leave and say, Hazrat, go get those objects. And the objects would disappear, and later they would appear in his possession, right? And he would go to the train station with a bunch of disciples, and he would touch all these tickets and say, okay, I'm not going to buy them. And then later he'd say, Hazrat, go get them, and Hazrat would get him the tickets. And so these objects would disappear and reappear. And so Yogananda's guru, Sri Yukteswar, said he saw this, where they put a watch in the water, a stone in the water, and then it reappeared. And then he made all of these dinner plates fall from the sky in the room, which were like these golden plates with a huge feast for all the people that were gathered, just out of nowhere. And then immediately Hazrat made them go away. And so what happened was, later in that guy's life, Afzal Khan, because he had become greedy, he came across an old man with a limp who had a gold ball. And the old man said, help me. And instead of helping him, he touched the ball and told Hazrat to take it. And eventually Hazrat made it disappear. And then he was in for a surprise, because the old man was the same guy who taught him the yogic technique. And he said, so this is what you've been doing with your powers, right? This is what I warned you about. So he took away the ability for the guy to control this genie, Hazrat, except for in a few instances, like if he was hungry or something like that. But this was an interesting story, and he had to write an apology in a newspaper. And I guess this guy was known as the Terror of Bengal. Like all the jewelry stores and the railroad executives knew to like watch out when this guy came by. And so he wrote this big long apology telling the story. Now, at first glance, modern seekers would be like, come on, that seems like something out of the Arabian Nights. Did this really happen? But then as I searched around, there are other references to stories like this, particularly within the Islamic traditions. But more than that, it's a story about karma. So let's suppose you were playing a video game and your part of your karmic task is to work on how greedy you are. Now, can you think of a better quest and a better way to test yourself than to give you an entity that can basically get you any physical object you want, right? To test whether you're going to be greedy or not. So in a sense, this story, it almost doesn't matter if it happened that way. Yogananda clearly believed it did, because this is a story about karma and how the universe might be able to create situations for us that are perfectly attuned, to our particular karmic challenges. I say karmic tasks, but quests are challenges. And sometimes you try to play a quest in a video game and you don't succeed. And then you got to go do it again later, right? And then you go do it again. So there's that whole element to this as well.
The stories in Autobiography are just astounding, and they're full of saints and yogis guiding Yogananda in precognitive ways about his own karma, and full of siddhis, which seem to occur on this path, but we're not supposed to get caught up in them.
Yeah, so many of the stories are about the siddhis, or the superpowers, as we would call them today. And, Yogananda was super curious about these, right? Whenever there was a saint who reportedly had a particular ability, he would like go out of his way to try to find this person. And there was one called the Levitating Saint, Baduri Mahashai. And, he lived not far from Yogananda initially. And his Yogananda's friend said, hey, I discovered this levitating saint. I saw him actually rise off the ground. And Yogananda said, oh yeah, I've been to see him many times. And, what Yogananda tells us is that these siddhis aren't the goal, right? And sometimes you can get caught up in the goal. Like there's the perfume saint. This was Ganda Baba, I think was his name. And he was able to make any scent of a perfume appear on your hand. And Yogananda went and asked him for jasmine. And then he went home and his sister said, oh yeah, what, do you have jasmine perfume on? What's going on? As soon as he got home. But he talks about how, well, Yogananda wasn't impressed that this guy was, understanding the laws of the physical world and how to bend them. And what was he doing? He was just making a little scent. And so he was warning us that we can get, these things can be an obstacle to our path. And the levitating saint, there's a whole chapter about him, and he has a ton of lessons for Yogananda, and they're not about how to levitate, right? And that was someone he called, a man of realization. Like one of the weird things, that he did was he stayed indoors for like almost 20 years. And when Yogananda asked him why, he said, well, because they assumed it was for his protection. So, the outside world doesn't crop in. And he said, no, it's for the protection of everybody else, right? Because when somebody is a saint, right, they know that this is all an illusion, and that, they'll say things to people that they don't want to hear because they're also caught up in the illusion. And so it's as much for the protection of everybody else. And then that guy was actually born to a very wealthy family, but he gave it all up to become a yogi, which, there are interesting stories like this throughout the tradition, like Prince Siddhartha, for example, who became the Buddha, or he tells the story of Mirabai, who was a Rajputani princess who gave it all up, right, to become this kind of famous yogi. And so, Baduri's disciples, who Yogananda wasn't formally a disciple, but, he was curious. So he would always try to go in, and he would talk about his sense of humor. And he talked about how saints have this sense of humor, right? And that it would make Yogananda roar with laughter, but his other disciples would get mad that Yogananda was laughing so much. They'd look daggers at him, but the saint loved it because he knows, how absurd the whole thing is. Somebody who has that realization. So anyways, his disciples would say, oh, sir, you're so wonderful. You gave up all these riches to be this yogi. and go for spiritual with him. And he goes, no, it's not me who's given up anything. I'm finding everlasting bliss and joy. It's those people who spend their entire lives toiling for a few rupees, who are giving up, the really important thing, which is this bliss that he's seeking. And so all of these stories of Siddhis usually have a purpose, but Yogananda also tells us that, they are signs of achievement along the way. So, for example, there was the Swami, the saint with two bodies, which is one of the early stories. When Mukunda was like 12 years old, Mukunda was Yogananda's given name before he became Swami Yogananda. His father was a railroad executive, and he sent him to the city of, Mukunda wanted to go to Benares to go sightseeing, and his father said, okay, I have a message to send to this guy, Kedarnath Babu. He's in Benares, but I don't know where he is. So take this message to the Swami in Benares. He gave him a first-class ticket on the railway to go to Benares. And the Swami will figure out where this guy, Kedarnath Babu, is, and he can give him my message. So Mukunda goes there, and, there's the Swami Pranabananda, and he's just sitting there in a loincloth meditating. And he goes, are you Bhagavati's son, which is Yogananda's father's name? He goes, yeah, how did you know? He goes, oh, yeah, I got the message. Okay, sit down. I'll find Kedarnath Babu for you. And so about a half hour passes, and Yogananda's like wondering what the heck's going on. The guy's not he's just sitting there meditating, right? I need to go find this guy. And he opens his eyes and says, don't worry, this guy Babu is on his way. He'll be here shortly. And he closes his eyes and starts meditating again. And so Kedarnath Babu comes in 15, 20 minutes later. Yogananda meets him outside, and he goes, are you Bhagavati's son? He goes, yeah, but how did you know? He goes, oh, the Swami came into the market where I was, and I saw him there, and he told me, and then he, walked back faster than I could, so I couldn't keep up with him. And Mukunda's like, but the guy's been sitting here for the whole last hour. He clearly didn't leave. And the guy asked a really interesting question, and I think this is an important question. He goes, are we living in a material world, or are we dreaming, right? And that, I think, is an important distinction. And so, part of the reason for the Siddhis is to show that these advanced adepts realize that the material world isn't so material, right? It's the same message we're starting to realize with modern science and with quantum mechanics. Yogananda said, if it must be so, let man learn from science that there is no material world. It's warp and woof is Maya, or illusion, right? And that was the same message that, these saints have been telling us. But at the same time, Yogananda was told, don't get too obsessed with these Siddhis or superpowers, because you won't get to that final liberation, which, is what the yogis are aiming for.
Those are fantastic stories, and it definitely brings up the veracity of them. And you share in your book that there was a woman who was researching in the Vatican who was able to find similar stories of precognition, telepathy, bilocation, and certainly parapsychology now has lots of evidence that shows that these abilities do actually and can happen.
Yeah. So, during the writing of this book, I interviewed Diana Pasulka, who's a professor of religion at University of North Carolina. And, she wrote a well-known book now on UFOs called American Cosmic UFOs, Technology and Religion. And I interviewed her to ask her about, these miracles. And she said, well, when she was a kid, she read Yogananda's Autobiography. She grew up in San Francisco. Her parents had it on the shelf, and she believed everything as a kid, because in the Catholic traditions, saints are doing all kinds of things. But then when she became a professor and entered into academia, she was kind of indoctrinated into this point of view. Okay, these things didn't necessarily happen. The miracles in the Bible, all of these things. We study religion as more of a social phenomenon, right? It's stories that people tell each other. And so, she kind of bought that party line. But then later, as she started to look into some of these anomalies and find, these weird stories, she actually, her field of study is Catholicism. And so she was granted access at the Vatican to their private archives, and she looked at the canonization records of Joseph of Cupertino. And so Joseph was a saint who supposedly floated up, in the plaza. And she said she saw the records put out by the devil's advocate, right? And that is the person that the church assigns to disprove this whenever they hear of a miracle. And this guy was, in her own words, a big time rationalist, right? Meaning this didn't happen. He couldn't have floated. Must be a bunch of BS. And so he went out to try to disprove it, but she found in the record that there were over 1,000 people who had seen, Joseph of Cupertino float up in the middle of the square. And so she came to believe that these things have been actually, could have actually happened, certainly within the Catholic traditions, and there's no reason they couldn't have happened within the yogic traditions, which has more stories of those. And so Yogananda may in fact be, just reporting on things he's actually seen, or in some cases what his guru and other folks that he talked to, had seen. And there are a ton of stories like these in there. And so, that's kind of where I think we need to be open-minded about this stuff. And that's one of the, people say, why did Yogananda include these stories? Well, one, they make the book more interesting. Two, he was trying to get Westerners in the whenever he wrote it, which was the 1930s through 40s, interested in yoga. But at the same time, I think he believed all of these things had really happened, and he had witnessed many of them himself, including his guru, who was, miles away, appearing to him in the flesh and telling him he was on the next train. There was a story about that as well, which was, you could call it a bilocation story, you could call it a story of telepathy. I mean, there's different, and with all the paranormal phenomena that people report, I think, we need to take these stories more seriously and take them at face value, that these things might happen. And then as we look for a way to understand how these things, are possible, it opens up our mind, right? I think that's the key point here, particularly those of us in the West. I interviewed another religious studies professor. It was on a different subject, but similarly, and he was early Christianity. He was a professor of early Christianity, and he said, in academia, it's either like, okay, these miracles aren't happening today, so they must not have happened back then. That's the default attitude, or, if you're a devout Christian, you say they happened exactly the way that they did, right? But he said there's a third option, which is that there are ways, yogis and other folks who know how to do this, who are adept, and that this may have actually happened, and that's a different way to think about it. We don't have to necessarily be a devotee of that religion to believe that these things actually happen.
Part of the development of Yogananda's story, his life, his karma, was this amulet that he was given by his own mother. Can you share about that?
Yeah, so this was, an interesting story of a magical object, if you will, what he calls an astral object. And so what happened was when Yogananda was a baby Mukunda, in the city of Lahore, this is, kind of near where I was born and where I lived, my parents lived, his mother had a visit from a strange sadhu, who knocked on their door and said, "I wish to speak to the mother of Mukunda." And so he was bringing a message from Yogananda's parents' guru, Lahiri Mahashai, who had blessed the baby when he was younger. And he said, so I'm looking for the mother of Mukunda, and she was there. And he basically told her that tomorrow, while she's meditating, this silver amulet will appear in her hands, and that, she may be going through some health issues in the future. And she was to give that to her oldest son, Ananta, to give to Mukunda 1 year after she dies, right? And so it's kind of a little bit of a morbid message there to get, but the next day she was meditating and she got an amulet materialized in her hands. And so, Yogananda, Mukunda, as I mentioned, was always trying to run away from home. And his mother, after his mother died, he was devastated. And that was a major, major event in his life. And he was still, just a boy, when that happened. And that was one of the reasons why he so identified with the Divine Mother. And in a lot of the stories, there's, prayers from him to the Divine Mother. And what happened was he was going to run away again. He was, I think, maybe almost a teenager at this point. And his older brother, about a year after his mother had died, said, well, okay, I wasn't going to give you this. I wasn't going to give you this, even though our mother told us to, because I think it's going to make you want to run away. And you're too young to run away yet to go be a monk. But he gave him the amulet anyway. And he told him the story of what had happened and where the amulet had come from. And, as soon as Yogananda held the amulet, it became, he felt this surge of energy and it was enough to satisfy him and he didn't run away to become a monk. He kept living at home. And then later, when he did graduate from high school, which he only did because his father insisted that he graduate from high school. He ran away to an ashram in Benares, right? And the only thing he took with him was this magical amulet. And he thought, okay, finally I'm going to go be a monk, right? And then what happened was in this ashram, he was disappointed because he wanted to spend his time meditating, and everybody else was, no, you need to be doing all these, tasks, organizational tasks, sweeping the floor, all these tasks, and he just couldn't find enough time to meditate, and so he was very unhappy there. And this was really the only possession that he had there. And then there was one morning when he looked in the kind of closed envelope where this amulet was, and it had disappeared. And he was, wondering what happened because it wasn't open. Like how? And it was that day that he went on an errand with one of the other boys in Benares, and he came across his guru in the streets of Benares, and he recognized. At first, he didn't recognize him, but as soon as he passed him, it was like this strong message in his head: "You need to go back." And then he looked at him again, and he recognized him from visions that he had while he was meditating. And turns out Sri Yukteswar was, like I said, only a few miles away from Calcutta is where he lived, but he happened to be in Benares on that day. And so, he told him that was the purpose of the amulet, was to kind of hold you over, and it disappeared back to whence it came. It was an astrally produced object that disappeared since it was time for you now to come and be my student. And of course, Yogananda decided to be his student and went back to Calcutta. And to his dismay, though, Yukteswar said, "You have to finish college, and only then will you be my student," because they had a sense that he might be going to the West in the future. And there were other little premonitions, around that whole idea of East and West and what Yogananda's life mission might be that came around that time. But that was the story of the end.
And his guru wanted him to go to college so that he could become more educated and understand English so that he could influence the West.
Yeah, absolutely. And so, there was another story about his guru, Sri Yukteswar, when he was young, and he was at the Kumbh Mela in Allahabad. The Kumbh Mela is like one of the world's largest festivals. It's a religious festival, and it happens every 12 years. And there's like 1 million people there. At least there have been. I don't know exactly what years it's now. And he went there as a young man, and he looked around, and there were all kinds of, weird sadhus and people doing strange things. And it was when he went to there that this young sadhu came up to him and said, "Oh, there's a saint over there, and he wants to talk to you." And he said, "Okay." So he walks over to the saint, and he could feel that, okay, this was a real kind of enlightened saint. And he started talking to him, and he said, I see, Yukteswar, that you've been thinking that the men of the West, who are so advanced in science and materiality, perhaps are better than all these dirty sadhus who are walking around, half naked. But there is a balance between East and West, right? That India could benefit from the material advances in the West, but the West could benefit from the spiritual, kind of undertakings and underpinnings of life that yoga represents. He said to Yukteswar, yoga is a golden middle path between activity and, calmness. And that's why it's really important to be out there. And then he said, "Swamiji, I'd like to give you a task." And he said, "First of all, I'm not a Swami." He goes, "Oh, don't worry, you will be." And he says, "The task is, I want you to write a book about the similarities between some of the Christian scriptures and the Hindu scriptures." And of course, Yukteswar said, "Really? That's a tough task. I don't feel ready to do that." But it was a task that was given to him. And he went about and he completed that task. And that book is now, available. It's called The Holy Science. It's a short book. But that task, laid the seeds, because Babaji told Yukteswar, again, according to the Yogananda story, that he would send him a disciple who would go to the West to carry the message of yoga. And so it was important that Yukteswar had this grounding of the scriptures, because if you read the Autobiography of Yogi, there's a lot of biblical quotes in there, right? And part of the reason is, it was for the West, it was a Christian country, but part of it is because, he actually came to believe that there were lots of similarities between, those scriptures. And part of that was because his guru had delved so deeply into that and taught him about that. And so you can see how the elements of the karmic task, his karmic task, was to bring yoga to the West, but there were elements of the story that needed to be there in order for that to happen, including this random invitation at the end, which didn't make a lot of sense, but happened, where he was supposed to be the representative at that conference in Boston.
Yeah, there certainly are a lot of similarities between yoga philosophy and Christianity. I mean, we look at the history, it seems that maybe they were all spending time with each other.
Well, depending on what you believe, there are stories of Christ going up into the Himalayas and, in certain traditions. In Yogananda's tradition, they talk about Babaji as being not just 100 or 200 years old, but many hundreds of years old. And supposedly he initiated Kabir, who was a medieval poet who was the Sufi and Hindu, and he pissed off the Muslims and the Hindus, and they kicked him out of Benares. And he had a famous quote in his poetry, is now quite famous, like along with Rumi's, is one of the kind of well-known poets from that tradition, where he said, I am neither at Kailash or in the Kaaba, which talking about Hinduism and Islam in that case. And supposedly, if you go even further back, Shankara, who reorganized the whole Swami order, who lived around 800 AD, supposedly Babaji met and initiated him as well. Now, how do we know if that happened or not? That's a different story. That's a different question. But I did ask around if there were other sightings or other traditions that relate to Babaji, that maybe weren't directly from Yogananda. Just because as modern readers, we tend to be a little more skeptical, right? As a modern, yogi, you're not necessarily devoting your whole life to one guru. You're getting information from different places. Today, all the Indian gurus around today are on YouTube, and we can go ahead and, we can find out about all that stuff. So anyway, there were other references to him from some other folks who claim to be of traditions that came off what I call the river of yoga, right? So you've got all of these tributaries that trace themselves back to Babaji.
All of this information is so wonderful. Thank you so much, Riz. Is there anything else you want to share today about yoga wisdom for modern seekers?
I would emphasize, what I said earlier. One of the lessons in the book is practice every day, no matter how much time you have, right? And I mentioned the actual definition of yoga, right? It's not you have to spend an hour doing the asanas, which you might want to do, but it's about the stilling of these riddhis. And anyone who's done like a physical yoga session knows at the end you often do shavasana, right, where you're laying in corpse pose, or translation that I like better is peaceful pose. And at the end, it feels like something is still, right? Something that was not still. And there are the physical benefits, there's the stress benefits, but that alone is the practice of yoga. And so if there's anything that you can do in your life on a daily basis, even if it's, 5 minutes of quiet meditation, or, when I lived in Silicon Valley, which is actually where I happen to be at the moment, I'm just down the road from Google. And, Silicon Valley is a place of frenetic activity and, lots of business and tech. But there's a little park next to it called Shoreline Park. It's right on San Francisco Bay. And I go there and I feel like I'm hundreds of miles away, from the frenetic activity of Silicon Valley. And there's this breeze coming in from the bay. And even just a short walk there is enough to still the vrittis, right? It's basically doing what yoga is supposed to accomplish. And so there are many different practices and types of yoga, whether it's karma yoga, bhakti of devotion, raja yoga, then there's kundalini yoga, right? There's so many different, but really it's about whatever practice in whatever spiritual tradition you're in, where you can kind of calm the mind, still things. So that snow globe, which we're constantly shaking, imagine having a snow globe and all you do is you just keep shaking it all day, right? You want to let it settle, at least for a little while. And that, I think, is the most important practice of all.
Beautiful and inspirational messages. Thank you so much, Riz, for being with me here today. It's been such a joy.
Yeah, this has been great. Thanks so much for having me on with you guys again.
And for those of you listening or watching, thank you for being with us. You are the reason that we are here.
We have now released issue 3 of the New Thinking Aloud magazine. Download it for free at newthinkingaloud.org.